Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, all honorable keynotes, abstract presenters, respected audience, and all our other guests. My name is Maritta Valimaki, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this first evidence-based research conference. And because I'm quite far from you and I'm aware that this video is not working properly, I will now stop the video and I continue only with my voice. It is not an accident or good luck that we are all here today. After 3 attempts, the evidence-based network received EU funding for cost action, Everest, part of which we are EBR conferences. We are grateful to the Cost Association, the European Cooperation in Science and Technology, who has made our dreams related to this conference a reality. We have planned the conference since the beginning of the Everest network, and since spring 2019, our scientific and organizing committee members and all the technical and marketing people around the world have been engaged to arrange such a beautiful program. So it would be lovely now to show the PowerPoint and our great success, what we have now. Because next I would like to warmly welcome all the delegates from across the world to join the conference. We have in total 773 participants from 70 countries across 6 continents. And the top 5 countries are China, UK, Norway, Mexico, and Spain. We are grateful that so many of you have engaged your time and joined our conference. And next I will share with you some house rules. In order to make our 2-day conference as smooth as possible, I would like to share some house rules with you. First, I would like to remind that name and affiliation in participant list should be same as for sign up. Second, all presentations have been pre-recorded and you can find them later on the conference website. Please feel free to share and use the videos later for any non-commercial purposes. In addition, the plenary sessions will be recorded live during the conference and can also be found later on the conference website. In Zoom, we are using the meeting session, not the webinar format, to encourage the audience to active participation. However, this means that all noise behind you may affect our presentations. Therefore, muting of microphones is key. During the conference, we have 2 Zoom rooms, conference room and social room. The conference room includes all presentations and you can listen and chat in your comments and questions for the presentations. It can be done during each presentation. In the social room, there will always be a host present to help with setting up small groups or private discussions if needed. In case of any questions or in need of technical support, please send a message to Klara using email address shown in this PowerPoint. Now I would like to introduce our conference theme, and that is increasing the value of research. The theme reflects ambition to ensure that new studies address questions that matter in a valid, efficient, and accessible manner. This can be achieved when prior research is used in a systematic and transparent way to justify and design new studies. This approach will help to ensure necessary studies, those justified by a knowledge gap identified from a synthesis of early trials, and relevant studies, those justified by obtaining the perspectives of end users directly affected by the new study. During these 2 days, we have plenaries, abstract and poster sessions with interesting presentations. I look forward to hearing about the influence, priorities, worries, and development ideas for evidence-based research from different angles and how it can be done together with different stakeholder groups. I am sure that the discussions about evidence-based research will continue after the conference. I am therefore happy to share with you that Elsevier has given promotional free access to 3 recently published powerful articles about the topic until 24th November 2020. Please use this opportunity. I sincerely hope that you all will enjoy these 2 days of debate and network. And now, I declare that the conference is open for further proceedings. I have an honor to welcome Klara Brunnhuber, Vice Chair of the Evidence-Based Research Cost Action, EBR, who will introduce you to the schedule of the conference program and will be sharing our morning session. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritta. I'm incredibly excited that this day has finally arrived, and we are here together, at least digitally, to kick off the first ever conference dedicated to evidence-based research. So first of all, let me introduce you to our conference program. The next 2 days will be divided into 2 morning and 2 afternoon sessions in terms of European time zones. Each day, there will be 2 full audience plenary sessions with usually 2 30-minute presentations, followed by Q&A. Plenary 3 tomorrow will be a bit of an exception, as we will be hearing 3 slightly shorter presentations from a panel prior to a joint panel discussion. You can see these highlighted here in the program in red. There will also be 4 abstract poster sessions highlighted in blue, with themes aligned with the 4 working groups of the Evidence-Based Research Cost Action EBR. Session 1 will focus on how to best raise awareness and identify barriers among key stakeholders. Session 2 on how to learn about and use the EBR approach. The 3rd session, tomorrow, is dedicated to the efficient production of systematic reviews. And finally, abstract and poster session 4 will look at the challenges surrounding EBR, including how to measure the level of adoption of EBR principles. Each abstract presentation will last for 20 minutes and poster presentations for 10 minutes, including Q&A. Every 90 minutes, you will be happy to hear, we will have a break, 30 minutes halfway through the morning and afternoon, and 90 or 80 minutes for lunch. Last but not least, don't forget to adjust the program timings to your time zone if they differ from Central European time. A few points regarding our sessions. All presenters have pre-recorded their talks, and our technical team behind the scenes will be playing these recordings, which hopefully should minimize the risk of disruptions due to connection issues for our speakers. We will also be sharing these recordings via the website following the conference. All 4 plenaries will be recorded on Zoom and again be shared online after the conference. Abstract and poster sessions will not be recorded. Regardless of whether the sessions are recorded or not, the speakers will be present in person during and after the sessions and very keen to answer your questions during the Q&A. We will follow up with an evaluation form after the conference to capture your comments and feedback on what went well and where we could do even better next time round. We are extremely keen to hear from you during the conference too. So please post your questions and comments into the Zoom chat. You can find the relevant button in the Zoom navigation bar. If you can't see it, you may need to touch your screen if you're using an iPad, or may need to maximize your screen as it can be hidden behind the 3 dots. Please make sure that you address your questions to everyone, not just a single participant. We have 1 or 2 dedicated vice chairs continuously scanning the chat for any incoming questions. Prioritized questions are then forwarded to the chair, who will put them to the speakers during the Q&A session. There are slight differences, as I mentioned earlier, between plenaries and the shorter abstract or poster sessions. During plenaries, the 20 to 30-minute long Q&As will occur once all presentations have been delivered, whereas the 5-minute Q&As for abstract and poster sessions will be scheduled immediately after each talk. There is, of course, a risk that we will be running out of time and not be able to answer all questions, but no questions will be lost. Our speakers will provide answers to any outstanding questions on the EBR's website following the conference. And don't hold back. Use your favorite social media channel to tell the world about the conference and your takeaway messages from our great speakers. If you aren't already, please make sure you start following at EBR's for EBR related information, links and updates. And when tweeting about the conference, use the hashtag EBRCon2020. And now we will kick off in earnest. So please switch on your video if your device has a camera and make sure you are muted. Have a fantastic conference, everyone. So it is a great pleasure and privilege to introduce today's first speaker, Professor Hans Lund from the Center for Evidence-Based Practice at Western Norway University, who is the chair of the EBR network and EBR's. I met Hans during a wonderful dinner at the Evidence-Based Healthcare Conference in Sicily 7 years ago, where we immediately clicked and started a conversation about research waste and the role of evidence synthesis to combat at least some parts of it. And this conversation and friendship has not stopped since. Without Hans's enthusiasm, determination, hard work, leadership, and diplomatic skills, the EBR approach, the EBR network, EBR's, and today's conference would not have been possible. So please join me in welcoming Hans, who will be introducing the evidence-based research concept. Hans, over to you.
Thank you, Klara. Thank you very much. I'm very happy for the opportunity to explain more about the concept of evidence-based research. In August 2020, the Swedish journalist Hanne Kjöller published a book. She called it The Crisis in the Research Question, or What the Hell Are We Getting for Our Money? In this book, Hanne Kjöller discussed some issues like research performed without recipients, research that has already been done, exaggerated and false research results. In other words, she had been she is discussing the many challenges facing research and science today. In a feature article from the Swedish Research Council's newspaper called Klara, she stated, for example, research which has done humanity so much good, is it really possible to question it? Transparency and self-awareness have proven to be an excellent medicine against misuse in a number of businesses. What about science? So to all shady researchers who want to keep the door between academia and the outside world closed, I would like to remind you that trust is something we have on loan. So among the many challenges facing science, just as you know, less trust in science, a large proportion of published studies are of poor quality, many conducted studies are never published, studies can't be replicated, and a large proportion of published studies are redundant. So the evidence-based research concept have chosen to focus on ensuring valuable research. So our answer to the many challenges mentioned, and especially the challenges of redundancy in research, we suggest to use, for the first, scientific methods to evaluate performance of research, to use scientific methods to improve the way research is conducted, and use scientific methods to monitor research practice over time. Thus, evidence-based research promotes the use of a systematic and a transparent approach when justifying and designing a new study. It promotes the use of a systematic and transparent approach when placing new results in the context of existing evidence. And lastly, we promote a more efficient production, updating and dissemination of systematic reviews, as they are the key element in order to justify and design and place new results in the context of existing evidence. Thus, the evidence-based research concept can be defined as the use of prior research in a systematic and transparent way to inform a new study so that it is answering questions that matter in a valid, efficient, and accessible manner. But who are we? Well, back in December 2014, a group of people met in Bergen and established the Evidence-Based Research Network. And this small network with people around the world applied for funding from the European Union, or more specifically from the so-called Cost Association, asking for support to establish a network. And after 3 applications, we in April 2018 was approved, and we established the 17th of November 2018 EBRES, an abbreviation of evidence-based research. And you can see here the participants from the first meeting in Bergen in February 2019. And I think EBRES have already most of the 39, maybe up to 37 or 38 of the 39 European countries affiliated to the COST program. So if we look about the first important item we are dealing with in evidence-based research concept, namely the use of scientific methods to evaluate performance of research, we performed a scoping review to identify all the meta-research that were dealing with different aspects of the EBR concept. And we have identified 83 meta-research studies with new data related to how research is performed when it comes to aspects of the EBR concepts. Here is one example of such a meta-research study. Karen Robinson, also a keynote in this conference tomorrow afternoon, performed and published in 2011 a study where she had identified, by the use of systematic reviews, a number of studies that could have cited earlier studies. She identified more specifically 1,523 original studies or primary studies that could have cited 3 or more earlier similar studies, and that's thanks to the systematic review they were identified from. It was possible to state how many that was published before this particular study was published. So you can see here that you have 240 of those 1,523 studies that actually could refer to 3 studies. You have 77 that could refer to 10 studies, and you have 137 studies that could have referred to 21 studies or more. But the results indicate that no matter how many you could cite, well, one would expect that if you could have cited 20 studies, maybe you will have cited a lot more than if you could have cited 3 or 4. But there was really no difference whether it was 3 they could have cited or 20 they could have cited. The median was 2. And in addition, she identified that 55% of those 1,523 original primary studies never cited any of the earlier studies, even though they could have referred to at least 3 of them. So the problem here is that a systematic and transparent approach is rarely used when citing earlier similar trials. Another example here is a study performed by Engelking and other authors, among them Livia Puljak, also a keynote to this conference tomorrow, where they were looking at studies within the anesthesiology area and looking if they were using systematic review to justify the new study. They find 126 that actually did so, but that was only 20% of the total sample of 622 studies. And, well, 44% did not cite a single system review at all. Again, we have a problem here. The systematic and transparent approach is rarely used to justify new studies. Based upon the scoping review, we actually are preparing a systematic review of the 13 studies, including Engelking and Puljak study, evaluating the use of systematic reviews to justify a new study. And this meta-analysis of the results from those 13 studies indicated that only 42% did so. Another example are systematic reviews used to inform the design of new studies. In United Kingdom, the NIH funding agency or scientific council of United Kingdom, they had since the middle of the zeros have the rule that everyone applying for funding should quote a systematic review in order to justify their study. And when they made an evaluation of a random sample of the proposals, they identified in 2006 to 8 42 studies, of which 89% were actually referring to a systematic review. And of course, in later years, such as the cohort from 2013, 100% were referring to a systematic review as it was a demand from the NIHR. But only in one aspect of the design of the study was the systematic review really used to inform the design or the method. And that was when it comes to the justification of the treatment comparison. more than 90% in both cohorts did so. All the other aspects, like withdrawal rate, adverse events, or duration to follow up, or informed standard deviation, and so forth, less than 10% were actually using the systematic review to inform the design of their study. So the problem here is that a systematic and transparent approach is rarely used to design new studies. And of course, we performed a systematic review of that too, and we find that 44%, only 44% actually use the systematic review to inform the design of a new study. Another example here is whether authors put their results in the context of earlier similar studies. If they actually were adding their new results to a synthesis of the present knowledge to see what's the difference between that. Only 3% of the studies identified in the month of May in the 5 high-impact journals did so. And only 37% made any kind of a systematic attempt to place new results in context. And as you can see from the figures here, from the 5 studies Clark, Hopewell, and Chalmers have performed, there was really no improvement over the time from 1997 to 2012. A problem here? Yeah, there is rarely a systematic and transparent approach used when placing new results in the context of existing results, and our systematic review related to this question showed that only 28% did so, based upon 10 studies, among which the 5 of the studies by Clark et al. Was included. So what we actually are trying to say here is that, of course, when you are planning a new research, you should be aware, you will use the competence you have as a researcher. What are you able to do? What have you learned? What is the available equipment you have? What are the available funding or economic support? What are the focus in the local scientific environment the researchers is working? All these aspects are, of course, very important for why a certain study is planned, a certain research question is selected. And when you have an idea for a question, you will, of course, use the underpinning research from basic science, theoretical science, qualitative studies, and that kind of studies to inform the research question and the design of this study. So what we are stating in the evidence-based research concept is that we, of course, this is very important what is mentioned here, but we would like to add 2 other aspects. First of all, whenever you're dealing with applied science, and maybe even in many cases also basic science, the synthesis or the end user's perspectives is very important. And we will clearly state that we will encourage to use a systematic and transparent approach when you are obtaining the end user's perspectives of relevance or non-relevance of the question and the methods and the design of the study. Similarly, we are clearly stating that you should have a systematic and transparent approach to all the earlier similar studies, and that's best performed by some kind of an evidence synthesis of these studies. And by combining the researchers and research context, the underpinning research, the synthesis of end users' perspectives, and the synthesis of earlier similar studies, you will have the full evidence-based research approach when you are justifying designing new studies and when you're placing new results in the context of present knowledge. But how actually to do that? It's easy to make this nice figure here, but how actually to do that? So we suggest this is an overall illustration of the process, and we suggest that researchers should consider something crucial before the study is performed and something similar crucial after the new results is obtained from this study. So what we actually are looking for is the first question, how to justify the study, actually how to justify the research question. So we suggest that using some kind of a systematic approach, transparent approach, could be a systematic review or other kind of evidence synthesis, to have a comprehensive understanding of the present knowledge or of the earlier similar studies performed until now. What do we know now and what is needed to move on in this particular area? In addition to that, we should also have a systematic and transparent attainment of the end users' perspectives. Not just ask some end users, but you should actually try to have maybe a systematic review of qualitative studies, systematic review of surveys or something like that. And the combination of those two aspects is really informing the process of your decision whether this research question is justified or not. If you have to say no to this question, is the research question justified? You have to formulate a new research question. If you are saying yes, answering yes to this question, you can use the knowledge from those evidence synthesis or systematic reviews to inform the design of the new study. Then you can conduct the study, and before publication, but when you have the new results, you should update the systematic review of earlier similar studies. So this you made here before the study should be updated. And you should evaluate what your new results means to this overall synthesis of the present knowledge. What is your contribution to the overall knowledge regarding this particular question? And of course the results of this including the synthesis, including the new results, have implications for practice and have also implications for research. We are fully aware that prepare or use or find, update and so forth, systematic reviews or evidence synthesis of any kind is very challenging. It can be very time demanding. So we are really fully supporting and are trying in any way we can to support a more efficient production, updating and dissemination of systematic reviews of all types. And you should be aware when we talk about the evidence ecosystem, generating knowledge, synthesizing knowledge and translation of knowledge, the evidence synthesis is the key element of the entire evidence ecosystem. But thanks to a number of organizations, this evidence ecosystem is actually possible if we are following the many advices and taking advantage of the many initiatives around the globe from researchers and interest group in trying to improve the quality of research. You can see that the evidence-based research approach is, of course, very important in the generating of knowledge, because we are stating how you can actually have a valuable research question, whether you have justified the question and you have a good design of the question. And you can see that evidence-based research is also important when it comes to the translation of knowledge, because when you in an original study are using a systematic approach to the present knowledge and adding your results to that, you can conclude whether it has implications for the practice or whether it have implications for research, meaning do we need more research or should we implement these results in a way that could, for instance within health, could make benefit for the patients. So we should use a scientific methods. That's the third aspect we are stating. We should use a scientific methods to monitor research practice over time. And the reason for this thinking is that the only reason we know about the challenge to science is because of meta-research. And Hanne Køller is emphasizing that very strongly in her book from August this year. The only way we can characterize the problem is by the use of meta-research. The only way we can quantify the prevalence and consequences of the problem is by the use of meta-research. So thus is the only way we can monitor any improvement is by the use of meta-research. And that's also why we know if we still have a challenge or if we have overcome the problem by using a scientific approach when we are justifying and designing new studies and when we are placing the new results in the context of earlier similar results. So Hanne Køller, she states in her book, to the question, what the hell are we getting for our money? The answer is less and less. She states that in fewer than 1% of studies had the researchers evaluated if the target group, and in this case she's talking about the patients, had any interest in the research question. Only 1% of the study have figured out if it was relevant to those the research were aiming for. Researchers in search of resources often ask, what can society offer us, not what can science offer society. And lastly, she states, maybe it's not more research that is needed, but we who ask the wrong questions. Or to put it in another way, we encourage researchers to make greater demands on themselves and thus achieve more credible and valuable results. We agree research must be free, but not at the expense of increased waste. We state that all phases of research must be systematic and transparent, including the planning of new research and the interpretation of new results. So what we encourage all to do is to join this evidence-based research network, and that goes for all kinds of researchers, all kinds of scientific disciplines. This is something started within health, but the problem is similar in all the other scientific disciplines, as well as we know from the contacts we have had to people in those areas. If you are working as a health researcher, you should join the EBRES as long as we have EBRES. When EBRES is ending within the next 2 years, we will of course continue to work in the EBR network. So you could join EBRES and you could participate in the EBR training school. And even if you are not within health research, the EBR training school could also be very relevant if you could live with the fact that the examples is from health. We encourage you to promote the concept of EBR in your own organization and your own research work. And we can tell you that we will be happy to provide any kind of material, any kind of papers, studies, whatever you need in order to promote this concept. We could even figure out to have some people in the future, hopefully it will be possible, to travel to your place and give a course or give a presentation. You're very welcome to approach us and ask for that. We encourage you also to use an evidence-based research approach when planning new studies. We encourage you all to use an evidence-based research approach when placing new results in the context of previous similar studies, and when formulating recommendations for practice and future research. Thank you very much for your attention and have a very good conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans, for this fantastic overview. I can see that a couple of questions have started to come in. Let me just try. Yeah, I'm trying to switch on my video. I don't know whether you can see me or not, but anyway, I'll just carry on. So please keep these questions coming during our next talk too. Our second speaker is Dr. Rieke van der Graaf, Associate Professor of Medical Ethics at the University Medical Center of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Rieke studied the classics and theology at Leiden University before doing her PhD on the ethical fundamentals in human subjects research. Her current research interests span global justice in international research, the integration of care and research, and the ethics of innovative research designs. She sits on Utrecht University's Research Ethics Committee and teaches a course on the Introduction to Research Ethics. We are incredibly grateful to have you with us today, Rieke, to speak about the ethical aspects of evidence-based research and the question of valuable research. Welcome.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts about valuable research. In this talk, I will focus on social value in health-related research involving humans, and I will start with 4 different hypothetical cases in which I illustrate the main topic of this talk, which is how to determine what valuable research is, and also what the position is of research ethics committees in this regard. Now, imagine that you are a research ethics committee member, and that you are about to start or to approve a clinical trial. The first case is case which I call flaws. A researcher wants to start a study that has some methodological biases, and a statistician in your group argues that there are high risks of false positive findings and that the sample size calculation is difficult to follow. Case 2, nice to know. A researcher wants to start a study that is well designed and most likely able to reach its endpoints. Furthermore, risks of participation are low and involve minimal burdens. At the same time, the study will contribute to the evidence base of disease X, but no major breakthroughs in the field are to be expected by the results of this study. Case 3, responsiveness. A researcher from a high-income country wants to perform a study in a low- or middle-income country. The aims of the study do not solve a question that is of research interest to the population in the LMIC, and the results will be transferred to the high-income country after the study is done. The study is well designed and most likely will produce results. Case 4, fairness. Researchers from high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries collaboratively want to start a study. Results will be shared equitably. However, the aims of the study do not address a question that is of global importance. The study is well designed and most likely will produce results. Now, unfortunately, this presentation is not interactive, but I guess most of you will have made the following distinction between the cases. Cases 2 and 4, nice to know and fairness, may produce value and may therefore be considered as acceptable, although some of you will have noticed methodological shortcomings or ethical questions. But case 1, flaws, will most likely fall below the line and may be classified as waste because of the methodological shortcomings, and I guess most of you will also consider 3 as unacceptable, since there is no benefit for those who have participated nor for their communities. I will return to these cases later, but let's first start with a definition of social value. So what is social value and why must studies have social value? Social value is a key principle in the 2016 version of the International Ethical Guidelines for Health-Related Research, prepared by the Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences in collaboration with WHO. And I take this guideline as central for my presentation This is not so much because I have been the scientific writer of the revised guidelines, but and this I may admit may pose some bias towards this document, but primarily because this guideline provides the most extensive version of the principle of social value in the literature. The very first guideline of the CIOMS guidelines reads as follows. The ethical justification for undertaking health-related research involving humans is its scientific and social value, meaning the prospect of generating the knowledge and the means necessary to protect and promote people's health. Patients, health professionals, researchers, policymakers, public health officials, pharmaceutical companies, and others rely on the results of research for activities and decisions that impact individual and public health, welfare, and the use of limited resources. Therefore, researchers, sponsors, research ethics committees, and health authorities must ensure that proposed studies are scientifically sound, built on an adequate prior knowledge base, and are likely to generate valuable information. Now the commentary explains, so the commentary to Guideline 1 explains, social value refers to the importance of the information that a study is likely to produce. Information can be important because of its direct relevance for understanding or intervening on a significant health problem, or because of its expected contribution to research likely to promote individual public health. The importance of such information can vary depending on the significance of the health needs, the novelty, and the expected merits of the approach, the merits of alternative means of addressing the problem, and other considerations. And the commentary goes on to explain the scientific and social value of research can be difficult to quantify, but it is generally grounded in three factors: the quality of the information to be produced, its relevance to a significant health problem, and its contribution to the creation or evaluation of interventions, policies, or practices that promote individual or public health. Now, the entry of the requirement of social value in the 2016 CIOMS guidelines was certainly not unprecedented. Many scholars trace its origins back to the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which states the experiments should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. But the concept also plays a key role in other international ethics guidance documents, such as the Declaration of Helsinki of the World Medical Association. This declaration states, the primary purpose of medical research involving human subjects is to understand the causes, development, and effects of diseases, and improve preventive diagnostic and therapeutic interventions. Now, apart from official ethics guidance documents, there are also, social value also plays a key role in ethics frameworks. For instance, in the famous 7 or 8 principle framework of Rieke, Manuel, and colleagues. And there you can see it is the very first principle among several other principles that should be met when you do research with human beings, such as scientific validity, fair subject selection, and a favorable risk-benefit ratio. Now, in 2017, Bioethics, the journal Bioethics, published a special issue on social value, and in that issue, Dave Wendler and Annette Riet provided an extensive analysis of the concept. They argue that the standard view on social value is that it is an ethical requirement for the vast majority of clinical studies, and they also argue that there is strong support that social value of research is important to have, and it's important for protecting participants who cannot consent, preventing inappropriate research that poses high net risks, and promoting appropriate investigator behavior. Social value, as we have seen in these guidance documents and in the literature just quoted, can be categorized along 2 dimensions. So there is immediate versus social value. So information can be of direct relevance in promoting health of individuals or communities, but it may also have direct value for subsequent research. For example, in case of early phase trials, the social value may lie in the distant future, and in those cases, research ethics committees may also assess the ability of trials to promote progression to later stages of research, in which successful clinical translation becomes likely. Another important aspect of social value is that it is to be understood as a requirement that counts prima facie, meaning that other ethical requirements should also be met, such as the principles listed in the Emmanuel framework, such as informed consent and fair participant selection. Furthermore, those principles should all be weighed and balanced. In relation to this second point, it is important to point out that social value is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to make research ethically acceptable. So, for example, the CM's guidelines on social value also explicitly talks about what social value cannot do. So, although scientific and social value are the fundamental justification for undertaking research, researchers, sponsors, research ethics committees, and health authorities have a moral obligation to ensure that all research is carried out in ways that uphold human rights and respect, protect, and are fair to study participants and the communities in which the research is conducted. So scientific and social value cannot legitimate subjecting study participants or host communities to mistreatment or injustice. So, whereas the merits of the social value requirement have been largely uncontested over the past few years, the concept has received critique and debate. And this attention for this concept has led to some improved understanding of the meaning and scope of this concept, but also to further debate. For instance, should a study have just sufficient, or should it have significant social value? Some are concerned that without the qualification significant, social value becomes too weak, whereas others argue that we simply may want to distinguish between studies that meet the threshold of sufficient social value and studies that don't. For example, Wendler and Ritz argue that whether a study has sufficient social value should always be determined in relation to the risks of research. In some cases, participants may face significant risks. However, if there's no social value to be gained, they argue that a study should not be approved, even if participants consent to participation. At the same time, if the social value is limited but the risks are minimal as well, they argue it's not unethical to offer participation. So the nice to know study, in case 2, may not be a problem for these scholars as long as the study meets a certain threshold of sufficient social value. Another area of debate is whether the concept applies primarily to the context of clinical research or also beyond. For instance, according to Nicola Barsdorf and Joseph Millam, social value should be seen as a function of expected benefits of the research and the priorities that beneficiaries deserve. Social value then also becomes a means to address questions of priority setting, promotion of health equity, and addressing health inequality. Scholars like Daniel Wenner ground the social value requirement in other principles than a non-exploitation paradigm that is the basis of the 8 Emmanuel principles. According to Wenner, the current view on research ethics is primarily about protection. Instead, she believes it should be grounded in justice-based considerations. She argues that certain developments in research, such as the inclusion of pregnant women, cannot be understood only from a protectionist view towards research subjects, but also have to be explained from underlying issues of justice. And if one thinks that the main aim of research ethics guidelines is to protect the individual from being exploited, then one might be satisfied. But if one takes a broader view and includes justice among the ethical principles that are relevant to such deliberation, then allowing a project without fairly distributed benefits is unacceptable from a societal perspective. This justice-based orientation has implications for case 4. So if social value is not only about protecting research participants from exploitation, but also about a fair distribution of burdens and benefits of research, again the question is where social value should be promoted and whether research ethics committees are the appropriate bodies to fulfill this task. So how can the emphasis on social value be explained? The emphasis on social value in the literature can be understood as part of a broader movement within the sociology of science, which describes how people come to accept certain scientific statements. Between 1900 and 1960, it was believed that science was a way of knowledge making and that its knowledge was about universal and absolute, and that its knowledge was absolute and universalistic. The correctness of scientific research needed no social explanation because it was simply true. What needed explanation was how false beliefs were mistakenly taken to be correct, typically by pointing at prejudice, bias, and so on. This is what Helga Nowotny in her book Rethinking Science calls Mode 1 research. Although this view is no longer supported by social scientists, it remains the common sense view of many scientists and the public. It is the idea that science can discover the truth. The value of science is whether the truth has been discovered and not so much the social value that it produces. However, between 1960 and 2000, scientific truth started to be seen as an outcome of negotiation and agreement located within social groups. Science became a human activity subject to all the strengths and flaws of humans. Nowotny speaks of Mode 2 research, in which interaction between science and society is taken as a starting point, and science has become a matter of co-creation. This perspective on the value of scientific knowledge illuminated the constructivist side of science. A risk of this type of thinking, however, was that this may produce the kind of relativism in which scientific claims have become just another opinion and alternative facts are as good as any other account. Therefore, from 2000 onwards, the idea of relativism becomes debated. Currently, we see programs such as the EU Programme on Responsible Research and Innovation, movements such as Open Science and Science in Transition. These programs try to reinvent the social value of scientific knowledge in order to enable science to perform tasks society has entrusted to scientists. They also encourage the involvement of all stakeholders in the production of science, including patients and the public, in order to increase the relevance of research results. Present-day problems in society are simply too complex to think we can solve them without cooperating across borders. Science cannot continue to take its own interests as primary instead of living up to its societal tasks. So currently, I'd say that the mainstream position in science is that it should not merely produce scientific value, but also scientific value that is socially valuable. So what are the implications for the cases? Case 1 cannot produce social value because if a study is scientifically flawed, it cannot produce social value. This is also in line with SEAMS, which claims a study cannot be socially valuable without appropriate and rigorous research methods to address the question at hand. The study that is not scientifically valid will use human beings in vain and can never be regarded as ethically acceptable. Case 3, however, is not methodologically flawed, but it violates the so-called responsiveness requirement. It does not address a health need or a priority of a particular community or region, and some might object that it is still okay to perform such a study if the participants have provided informed consent and the results will at least provide benefits to some, even though these people live in high-income settings. However, most ethicists, I guess, will say that despite the contribution to scientific knowledge in general, the distribution of benefits and burdens is then unfair. So there might be valuable results, but they violate what is locally valuable and hence will be unfairly distributed. A guideline that well explains this responsiveness requirement is SEAMS Guideline 2. I would argue that for cases 2 and 4, the nice to know and the fairness case, the ethical question is primarily whether the value can be maximized. So the question is not so much whether they count as waste, but how to increase the value. It will be difficult for a research ethics committee to reject these protocols since they seem to meet the threshold of sufficient social value. Although some research ethics committees give advice how to improve the value and to gain more results, the question is whether it is their task and whether they should not simply stick to their task of assessing protocols. Eventually, I believe that the task of a research ethics committee is primarily to prevent waste by assessing protocols, but not to promote socially valuable research. And therefore I think we should reconsider the role of research ethics committees in this process, and particularly not to wait with protocols until the very last stage in the research process to increase the social value of a study. Now, how should the research process be rearranged in such a way as to increase the social value, and what should the role of research ethics committees be in this process? In 2015, The Lancet arranged for a special issue on research waste and increasing value. They also presented an overview of 5 pillars to avoid research waste, running from priorities in research questions to avoid biases in reporting. My recommendations for rearranging knowledge gathering are largely in line with that of the Lancet series proposed earlier, but what I want to add for now is that we will also need to leave the non-exploitation paradigm with the Research Ethics Committee as the final judge whether a study is ethically acceptable. Instead, I think we'll need a justice paradigm to realize the ambitions as laid out in the Lancet series. We will need to intervene in the system much earlier to increase social value and not to wait until the very last moment. First, to increase social value, we may want to rethink science in terms of agenda setting. A prominent issue of debate is the issue how to bridge the efforts of basic researchers with those of clinical researchers. There is much debate about the so-called valley of death, the idea that basic and clinical researchers do not talk too much and that society primarily invests in basic research and not so much in translational research. Some countries have national research agendas, such as the Netherlands, with a more or less democratic process on what should be studied. At the same time, there are just a limited amount of grants available under such a program. Furthermore, the grants are often awarded provided that the REC gives permission, which leads to a catch-22 situation. So even though research ethics committees are still able to judge independently, I think it would be better to build in scientific and ethical review mechanisms much earlier in the process. The second issue is the production of science and scientific knowledge. Part of the critique concerns the replicability of the research results, which in some areas is disturbingly low. Another part concerns the way in which scientists are evaluated. In many areas of science, this is done, at least until recently, by looking at the number of articles produced and or the number of times an article is cited in combination, for instance, with the Hirsch index, and it creates an incentive to produce enormous quantities of papers. But the most important critique, also implied in what I've just said, is that science appears to be concerned more with producing science as such than with furthering socially valuable research through research. Although, already in 1994, Doug Altman argued that researchers feel compelled for career reasons to carry out research that they are ill-equipped to perform and that nobody stops them. He wrote, "We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons." So evaluated along these lines of Doug Altman, the nice-to-know case does lead to research waste, but it may not be something that research ethics committees can prevent from happening. Third, science needs to be more engaged to become socially valuable. Public engagement in research is important, first because patients should consider themselves as partners and in a trustworthy system, and not just passive sources of information, and second because the purpose of patient involvement is ultimately to improve our health. And by this I do not mean through individual healthcare, rather I suggest that this can come about by ensuring that those who conduct research projects ask the right questions. use the right endpoints, make the right choices, and effectively implement their findings. This illustrates the efficiency argument as applied to input from patients and wider publics who are similarly motivated to find answers to health and disease-related questions. Although patients and public are much more involved in evaluating research than some years ago, they still play a marginal role, and there are insufficient mechanisms to evaluate whether patient engagement has been meaningful from the start. But they could be seen as an important step to improve the value and to build in review in the system in order to improve the value. At least in the Netherlands, patient engagement is not a necessary requirement to improve a study protocol, and there's no mechanism to upload, for example, a letter from a patient society that has done an independent evaluation, so they also usually don't sign the protocol. Fourth, to increase social value also means that it needs to be fair, for example in terms of serving the interests of understudied populations or contributing to Sustainable Development Goals. In 1990, the Commission on Health Research for Development estimated that only about 5% of the world's resources for health research, which totaled $30 billion in 1986, were being applied to the health problems of low and middle income countries, where 93% of the world's preventable deaths occurred. And although the figure is no longer exactly correct, the Global Forum still argues that health research applied to the needs of low and middle income countries remains grossly under-resourced in many areas. Again, whether a study contributes to the 1090 gap is not something that can be determined by a research ethics committee, but should take place at much earlier stages. Therefore, the 1090 gap figure has more value at the beginning of a research process. So, concluding remarks. In order to increase the value, several initiatives have been undertaken to produce more social value. What I add in this presentation is that the RAG should only be seen as a last resort. Through increase in social value cannot come from altering the tiny bits and pieces at the end stage of designing a protocol. It should come from improvement in oversight and review mechanisms in the system itself. And to enable such a step and to find a new place for evaluating the social value of a study, it will be essential to somewhat leave the currently dominant model of protecting research participants by avoiding exploitation, with the Research Ethics Committee as the final judge of it. Instead, if we want to increase the value of studies, we may need a systemic change that relies on engagement and collaboration of stakeholders rather than regulation only. Therefore, it will also be essential to embrace a more justice-based perspective that allows for sincere improvements in social value by focusing on agenda setting, research priorities, and fair distribution of benefits and burdens before protocols are written. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rieke, for this really thought-provoking talk. We have received quite a number of questions from our audience. So let's kick off our Q&A now. And I have a question for you, Hans, first of all. Quite a few received from Matt from the NIHR in the UK. So what do you say to those who claim there is no issue anymore? We are already doing this anyway, this evidence-based research thing.
Well, the case is that in any paper you will find, any scientific paper, there will be references for earlier studies. So in that way, scientists have always tried to use what is already there. The problem is not that they are not using to refer earlier studies. The problem is the lack of systematicity and transparency in the process of arguing or justifying a study or designing a study. That's really the problem. And that's what the meta-research so far have shown, that the problem is actually maybe even bigger than Ian Chalmers and Paul Glasgow thought when they wrote the paper about research waste back in 2009. You need more to elaborate? You are muted, Klara. But I can just add that the big challenge here is actually how to do that, how to be systematic and transparent. That's not easy. It's easy to say that you need a systematic approach, but how actually to do that? And that's why we need the network. That's why we need to have this kind of conference again and again to discuss how to do that. It's not easy with this online conference always. Maybe Matt, can you unmute and maybe take over? I don't know what's.
Yeah, sorry, Hans, I was desperately trying to find the unmute button, and that's just use it. So yeah, it sounds like Klara is having a bit of struggle. So we had some other questions. One from Cordula Braun from Cochrane, Germany. Broadly, it was. I often wonder how it can be possible for new studies to not adequately be justified by existing systematic reviews, or how is that even possible? It shouldn't. Is it, and should it be a requirement of ethics committees, journals, and
the question that it was a surprise. I saw this comment on the chat, so it was a surprise. That is not the case. I think that, when I first started doing systematic search for literature, I was giving a big book to browse through, and it took hours and days and months just to do a simple search that we today maybe are using 15 minutes to perform. So it's a rather new. The digital revolution is actually the reason for us even to be fair when we are asking for being systematic. It was not possible just 25 years ago. So that might be one reason that it's not easy. A lot of researchers don't know anything about systematic reviews. There is a mix of the understanding of reviews compared to systematic reviews, and so it's really a culture change we are asking about, and it's much bigger than we are thinking about, because people have just used to pick the reference that fits into the chain of arguments. They're not asked to do that systematically. That's the case.
Great, thanks. It's a question for both, actually. So perhaps if Rieke kicks off, it says that most would agree with your arguments about the need for evidence-based research on various different grounds that you've both eloquently set out. So why don't we do it more? And is that a misalignment of incentives across the system? And if so, what could we do about that? So Rieke, do you want to kick off with that one?
Thanks. That's, I think, an excellent question, because it is at the heart what we are talking about. And so what I wanted to stress in my presentation is that I think the current way for evaluating social value or the use of systematic reviews is that we leave it to research ethics committees, and that we really need something new, a new approach. For instance, staged review or review much earlier in the process to address this important issue. And I was also thinking, after hearing Hans's talk, perhaps the evidence-based research network could fulfill a small task, or be given more of a mandate, or provide guidance for research ethics committees how to take the value of the research systematic reviews on board when they, for instance, evaluate the rationale for in a new protocol for a study. It is not something that I know how to do as a member of a research ethics committee. I'm the ethicist, so usually this is done by the clinicians and the methodologists, but still I think all of us should be able to understand what's happening and whether the information is sufficient in order to justify the study. So I think that we need new mechanisms for controlling and evaluating, and perhaps the evidence-based research network could do more, but this is just a suggestion.
Great, thanks, Rieke. Hans, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I can. I fully agree, Rieke. I really think that we should take advantage of any incentives we can, and you know, the incentives from being accepted or not accepted by the ethics committee is one important incentive. Being published or not is another. Getting funding is a third incentive. But what we actually are talking about here, and you have so nicely put that forward, what we are talking about is an issue for the researchers so early in the process that we are touching on the creativity, on the idea process. That's actually what we are talking about. And that's so early that maybe we are not talking about the PhD students, because when a PhD student is entering and coming into a research group, the research group should have figured out if this overall questions where there maybe are 3 or 4 PhD students involved really are of value or not of any value. So we are dealing with a process that normally are hidden in the chambers of even the single researchers, secretly in quotation mark, of course, trying to figure out what is really important here and what kind of questions, or maybe sitting together with colleagues and discussing it. So we need to have a transparency here. We need to have a systematicity here.
Great, thanks, Hans.
Very early.
Question from, and apologies, I should have said at the outset about pronunciations of names here, but Shelley Pranic from Croatia to Rieke, couldn't qualitative research along with quantitative research enrich and further increase the social value of research by identifying problems to be addressed? So I guess the question is, are we too narrow in the sorts of evidence that we bring forward in order to assess social value, and should that be broader?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent point as well. So I thought but perhaps I'm wrong, that this would be included in your systematic reviews, so also qualitative research, but perhaps not. And if not, then I think it's a really good idea to also include that. But I think we also have to accept that sometimes, even if we have systematic reviews and we have evidence of qualitative research being done and qualitative research being done, then sometimes the research question is so new that we also need a conversation with a patient association that is done at the moment. So and that we want to have them join the research protocol, or at least help the researchers to inform the questions being asked. So I very much support the idea that more evidence is needed in order to increase the scientific value, in order to increase the social value. I think we also need something like patient engagement in addition to scientific evidence.
Great, thanks. And there's a follow-on question for that, I think, which is how do you objectively evaluate social value of research, which I think is what you're starting to explore there. But it says, goes on to say, is there a checklist to guide us through this? So I guess to broaden that slightly, is there a well-established methodology for answering the kind of questions that you're raising?
No, so what I said is that it might be really difficult to quantify social value, and I think it's eventually evaluating concepts. So what I said, so SIOMS points at the quality of the information to be produced, the relevance to a significant health problem, and the contribution to the creation or evaluation of interventions that promote individual or public health. And that are the sort of issues that you may think about when you are designing or a study or evaluating a research protocol, that those sorts of issues have been addressed. But then the question is this just sufficient, or social value, or should it be significant social value? And I think there's sometimes discussions in research ethics committees, but then you also get the complaint that the research ethics committee is intervening in the design and in a way that is not necessary, because their function is only to evaluate whether it's sufficient, whether it meets a certain threshold, and is it whose role is it to raise the bar from significant, from sufficient to significant social value? So that's sort of an open question. I think bodies much earlier in the research process.
Fantastic, and actually may link back to some of Hans's points earlier about the need for meta research, because those sorts of questions about how do you do that can only really be answered through meta research, I think. Hans, taking it back to you, one of the points that you made, which I think links to this part of the discussion, is that evidence-based research is not just about systematic reviews of the literature in the way that I'm sure we all understand and have got in our mind. It's also systematic inclusion of end user, service user perspective. We talk, and that may well be slightly more surprising to perhaps not to today's audience, but certainly the wider scientific community, because we talk a lot about the former, about how do you do systematic reviews and what they are, and we don't talk much about the latter, which is about the systematic involvement of user perspective. Do you think the latter is done well and we don't need to talk more about it, or do you think there's a big challenge there as well?
Well, there is actually two challenges. First of all, we absolutely need also to be systematic and transparent and even fair to the majority of the patients or the clinicians or whoever end users you're talking about when you are figuring out what are the experiences, what are the perspectives of the end users of the research you are planning to do, the end users of the results of the research. And I mean, you could state that you could just invite some representatives, but it is very problematic when it comes to a systematic approach to what the end users are thinking. There's a lot of, I will not go into detail here, but there's a lot of challenges there. So what we are suggesting is that in the first step, and that's exactly what we talked about before, it should be very early in the process of figuring out our research question. We should be informed by the end user's perspective, experiences, attitudes, but this should be combined with the information from the systematic review of earlier similar studies. So you know what is the existing evidence and what is the existing attitude, experience, perspective from the end users, and this should be combined. And I actually put in the chat a question for Rieke, because I was thinking that maybe Rieke would be able to give us some advice here, how actually to combine those two components and how actually also include patient representatives later in the process of running or conducting the study. So I'm actually, my answer to your question, Matt, is that we are really trying to figure out what is the best solution here in order to be systematic and transparent.
Great, thanks, Hans. So I think if I've got my timings right, we've just got a couple of minutes left before the break. So I've got one more question, then I'll hand back over to Klara to wrap up. I think she's back online now, and it's for Hans. And there was a really important question: is how do you join EVBRES?
Yeah, I just in the chat, I can do it after the talk. I just put the link again. There's a link to evbres.eu where you have the contact and you can see how you should do it. But everyone should be aware that the cost action is only for 4 years. It's primarily for European countries, but we absolutely would like to have people as collaborators from outside Europe as well. So please go, and I put it in the chat again so you can see it. There's a link you can use, and in that way you can join. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. So just to give my thanks to everyone that's asked questions, to the two speakers, some fantastic talks and great discussion on the questions. And hopefully I'll hand back over to Klara now to wrap us up for the break.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you also for stepping in when Zoom abandoned me. So that shows our truly collaborative effort here. Thank you all for a wonderful session. Thank you in particularly to our two speakers, also to all who have posed such exciting and interesting questions. And we will make sure that all aspects will be fully covered also on the website later. So we now have a 30-minute break, and we'll see you back at 11:30 a.m. Central European Time for our first abstract and poster session.